Hi, I'm gonna preface my question to say that I don't believe in any sort of deity,
Okay.
and that I stopped believing odd years ago.
Okay.
And so my question that I wanted to ask you with, not out of the idea that you might change my mind, but simply out of curiosity for what your perspective on the question would be, is why should one believe in Christianity over any other religion when throughout history we have seen thousands of religions that have been in the heart of this earth that I feel like over time lost their validity due to human discovery? That, for example, you see in the past of the leaf and lightning gods, because out of question of how does that happen, I wonder why electricity strikes the earth, because, and I don't have a way to explain it, and so I justify that by saying that a god came up with this at some point. I don't know why plants grow out of the ground, and so I say that there's a harvest god because it gives me a way to understand what is currently unbelievable.
Sure.
But when we find answers to that through human ingenuity, we usually end up losing the validity of those sort of gods. And when I see the modern gods of today that tend to persist widely across the world, I feel like the answers that they tend to give people is usually answers to death and afterlife, which are foreign concepts to science because they're not something that science can contend with. It's not something that you can derive an answer from because you can't bring a camera into someone's brain, cook, pack, or dying. You don't know where they go. You don't know anything happens to them. It's the same thing with afterlife. You can't bring a camera up into heaven. You can't bring it into hell and know that there is a place that you may or may not go.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just curious what the perspective would be, given that it's really just, from my perspective, something that is based in something that is used largely as comfort rather than a thing that has much evidence to it.
Sure. Thank you. What's your name?
Evan.
Hi, Evan. Thanks for the question. I do have a follow-up question for you before I get into the substance of it, because it's an incredibly important question, and I appreciate the way you asked it. Do you think that science is the only way to verify truth?
I think that seeing evidence is usually the way that I verify truth.
Okay, but science isn't the only way, or is that the primary way by gathering evidence and making scientific ways and then putting the scientific method?
I think that usually running something through some, like the scientific method in some form or manner, is usually the way to find the way to a sort of truth.
So, but I want to make sure I understand correctly, because you used the word usually, which suggests that you don't think that's always the case, right?
It may be.
Okay, so it can't be, because the statement you just made, I can't verify scientifically. So science doesn't answer everything. It literally doesn't even answer the question you just raised. In fact, the statement you made, that science may be the only way to understand the world, itself cannot be scientifically tested. So we already can establish, by virtue of the way you asked your question, science is not the arbiter of truth, and it's not the sole arbiter of truth. It is an arbiter of truth, absolutely, 100%, but it's not the only one. In fact, the claim that we should treat each other well is a moral claim that you can show scientifically the results of, but you can't justify philosophically. There's philosophy, there's sociology, there's all these other things, and these aren't hard sciences. Philosophy is not even a science at all. So there's plenty of ways to actually look at the world and understand what's real about the world, whether it's material or immaterial, without having to resort to a hard science of some kind. We do plenty of things here. This university is lousy with them, with fields that aren't hard sciences. To say otherwise would be to invalidate almost everybody else's major. I don't know if you're studying science here or something else, but my guess is anybody else here who's not studying science, if science is the only way to validate truth, you're wasting your time, because you're just studying sophistry. So I think that's the first thing. It can't be the only way to understand the way the world works. In fact, what I would suggest is, as many scientists themselves have pointed out, is that science is a beautiful and wonderful tool for looking at the world through a keyhole. There's a huge room you can look at, but science is peering through a keyhole and seeing the validity of part of the world, but not the whole thing. And so if we colored everything through the lens of science, we're going to miss out on a whole lot of things, because we're looking at something only with a magnifying glass as opposed to something that can actually be a wide spectrum angle. And I think philosophy and other things are wonderful ways to look at the world. Second is that that, as I look at the question you've raised, the first thing is I would say is that those other systems of belief have all, in fact, fallen by the wayside because we needed to explain lightning, so we invent Zeus or Thor or whatever it is. I get all that. What you're basically referring to is what's called the God of the gaps argument. The God of the gaps argument goes like this. We have gaps in our knowledge, and we force God into the gap to explain the thing we don't know. Now, here's what's interesting about that. The biggest pioneers in science, historically, pre-Enlightenment, mid-Enlightenment, and post-Enlightenment, have been religious believers, including and especially Christians. I could rattle off a bunch for you right now who never looked at the world and said, I don't understand that. I'll plug God into the gap of that understanding, and I won't study it anymore. Gregor Mendel, Galileo Galilei, Nicholas Copernicus, even with the stories you've heard about the church and Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo, largely misunderstood stories, they remain Christians, not by force, but by choice. And you look at Ard Louis, who is a professor of quantum physics and mathematics over at Oxford University. You look at John Lennox, who got triple doctorates in mathematics. You look at Hugh Ross, who is an astronomer out of Caltech. Rebecca Carlson, who is a physicist out of Purdue University. All of these people are fierce believers in Christianity in particular, and they didn't hang out their faith on the hook and then put on their lab coat. They actually went into the system, into the lab, because of their desire to see the mind of the maker, to discover that. So, for example, if you study art history, or not even art history, art theory, and you understand how Rembrandt created the masterworks he did, or Da Vinci, or Picasso, or whoever else, and you understand the theory behind these things, and the colors, and the whatevers, and all that stuff, you're not less in awe of Rembrandt. In fact, the more you know, the more in awe of them you actually are. The more you study Mozart, the more in awe of the genius of Mozart you are. The more you study music theory, the more you know to be awed by. So your awe by agency is not less because you know more. It's actually more because you know more, because you studied these things. I don't know any Christians, zero, who believe that I don't understand how that works, and so I'm going to plug God into the gap of my understanding and then not study it. It's not how, I don't know anybody who thinks that way, like literally nobody. Now, let's make a contradistinction on this, okay? Evan, there is last year I believe it might have been 2024, so forgive me if I get the year wrong. 2 men won the Nobel Prize in chemistry and biology because they discovered the workings of a thing called microRNA. Now, microRNA is important because what microRNA does is it actually aids in the transcription of protein synthesis within our bodies. Now, for the longest time, because we assumed mindless, blind, unguided evolution, that 96% of the human genome does nothing. Like 96% of your DNA doesn't really code for proteins. And that was called junk DNA, because it's a vestige of previous instances of evolution that didn't have any design in it. So when we got bigger brains, we needed less big muscles. And so our DNA changed, and those things that coded for those big muscles and those thick bones and lots more hair and all that stuff, those things started to go away, but they're stuck in the code. But they just don't do anything anymore, so they're dormant. They're so-called junk. See where I'm going with that? So this junk DNA is a result of mindless evolutionary forces. And so we shouldn't expect it to do anything. Only 4% of the genome does anything. Until these guys come along, and a project called the ENCODE project comes along and says, well, wait a minute, let's challenge that idea, that maybe this stuff isn't so-called junk after all. And with the discovery of microRNA and what it does, and the ENCODE project looking at the structures and the things that the 96% of the genome does, it actually helps. The 96% helps the 4% do its job. So here's my point in this, is that when you look at the Bible, in Proverbs 25, verses 2 and 3, it says, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but it is the glory of kings to seek a matter out. In other words, God doesn't keep things from us so that we label this mysterious thing, God did it, so I'm not going to talk about it. It's we engage in the process of discovery, is that he delights when we actually figure out something we didn't know before. And so, if we take that situation, if we don't assume gaps in our knowledge that we plug in with God, but rather there's gaps in our knowledge and there is a design behind all of it, which means it's intelligible in the first place, then we actually begin to explore the world God had made, which is, as Einstein said, unintelligibly intelligible. He, who's not an atheist, by the way, said, I never said I was an atheist. I find it amazing that this world makes any kind of sense at all, which suggests there's an intelligence behind the whole thing. So, back to jump DNA. If we assume there's nothing behind us getting here, it's all just random. It's all just, natural selection and random mutation. Jump DNA should have no purpose. But if we started off with the assumption that nothing is accidental and everything seemed to have a purpose, we would have studied jump DNA decades ago and not ignored it and had these discoveries well in advance. So what I would suggest, Evan, is that it is the belief that there is a grand designer behind everything that impels us to discover the way he designed everything, as opposed to just assuming it's random. And so if we had assumed God, we may have come to discoveries earlier, not later. So I think the Christian faith actually impels us to want to discover the world that God himself has made. It was Francis Bacon, I believe, who said, "O God, as I study your universe, I find myself thinking your thoughts after ye." And math and intelligent design and the infinitesimal fine-tuning of the universe suggests that choices were made. And we're just here trying to understand those choices, not to plug God into this mysterious gap of knowledge we have. So I hope that's a beginning of a response to a very thoughtful question, Evan. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.